Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in to this webinar called Sharing Our Stories, Writing for Social Justice. We're so delighted to be wrapping up our series this fall by this hands-on training by some phenomenal women leaders. We have with us today Jennifer Farmer from PICO.
Hi, everyone.
And we also have Catherine Woodiwiss, who is here at the Sojourners office with me. And I am Elena Ramsey. You've probably seen me throughout the series. I am the Women and Girls Director here at Sojourners. And we've been focusing this fall on the power of storytelling and the narratives and the messages that we share with each other and with our communities. And with that, also lifting up the leadership of women who are telling powerful stories and untold ones. Particularly as we look at justice issues. So this fall, we've examined domestic violence as that intersects with gender, as well as that of climate justice and overall of women's leadership. But today's webinar will be all about gaining the hands-on tools that we need to create just better narratives about women in media, as well as persons of color. And so with that, you're going to hear from Catherine and Jennifer in a minute, and I will be sure to tell you more about them. But I absolutely want to encourage all of those who are tuning in today to please follow along also on Twitter. You can submit your questions at Sojo Women or SOJO Women, and we'll have an opportunity after the remarks and presentations to then address your questions. And so without further ado, I would love to throw it out to Jennifer and Catherine first to hear about your individual stories, what it is that has brought you into journalism and advocacy writing. And so if you would, let's start with Jennifer. If you could share about a person or a moment in your life that first influenced you to write about social justice, we'd love to hear that.
Thanks, Elena. So I have always been interested in elevating stories of communities that would otherwise go unnoticed. And I'm referring to primarily marginalized communities and communities of color. And I think for me, being a consumer of the news and the media, I was aware of the many ways that the media consciously and unconsciously criminalizes people of color and reduces the amount of sympathy that is shown to communities of color based on how they write the stories, the words that are used, the images that are showcased along with stories. And so for me, I wanted to write as a way to reclaim power and to show people an alternative vision.
Ooh, that's deep. Reclaim power. And there's such power in the pen. And Catherine, tell us also a person or moment in your life that's inspired you to join this movement.
Sure. I grew up in an upper class, mostly white, conservative evangelical town. And I was in high school when September 11th happened. And I remember the narratives immediately after that, along with the shock and pain and trauma of the lives lost, an immediate narrative of revenge and kind of going after the people responsible, a demonization of Islam, and a reassurance in my community that, you know, we were the ones on God's side and God was on our side. And, it struck me even as a high schooler, there were very important narratives of human dignity and the image of God in each of us that we were missing. And that was my first kind of early awakening to the importance of telling stories that, like Jennifer said, highlight perspectives of those who are suffering under systems of violence in every way and systems of oppression in every way. When I came to Sojourners, a few months into my time here as one of our online editors, I started telling stories of women in the church who had been victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, And that started for me as a theological and political curiosity. How are our political leaders that claim a Christian faith informed in how they treat women? But as I was telling those stories, it became more and more personally convicting and illuminating to me just how damaging sometimes narratives of faith can be when only told by those who historically have held power. And that was a major reconfirmation for me in my work currently at Sojourners to, in my own work, try to tell stories that cause not harm, but create the possibility for empowerment and healing, and then also to elevate the voices of others who are telling their own stories and stories of their own communities as well.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that both of you have just reflected on what it means to bring your whole selves to this work, and that you're thinking critically about whether it creates common good or if it adds harm or not. And so we look forward to hearing more of your thoughts about ways that we can think critically about the media that we're consuming and interacting with on a daily basis. And so I am just delighted that Jennifer is going to kick off our training here with just all the great best practices and skills that she's observed over her years as a prolific writer, speaker, communications advisor. Currently, Jennifer is the managing director for communications at PICO, one of our great partners. And so it's always a joy to be able to continue to work with Jennifer and PICO. And also, Jennifer has a book coming out in June 2017 called Extraordinary PR, Ordinary Budget, a step-by-step guide. And so look forward to seeing that, and really encourage everyone to continue to learn more about the good work that Jennifer's doing. You can tweet at her through Farmer8J, or also through PICO Network, because of course she manages their communications. And please, folks, for those tuning in, submit your questions at Sojo Women, and we'll be sure to have Jennifer and Catherine respond to those at the close of the webinar training. But Jennifer, if you would, please teach us how to write for social impact.
Sure. And let me first say thank you, Alana, for extending the invitation for me to be a part of this conversation along with Catherine. And I applaud Sojourners for really being intentional about thinking about the power of language and how that influences the work that we all care about. I also want to thank you for calling me a prolific writer. You are speaking prophetically. So let me just share a little bit about why this topic is so important to me, and some of the things that I've picked up along the way that could be helpful to you all in your journey. Lucy, can you advance to the next slide? So when I think about writing for social impact, I really think that, one, I feel like writing is therapeutic. And a lot of times when I consider the crises that our nation is facing, whether it is around environmental justice, racial justice, disparities in how children of color are treated in schools, I really view writing as a way to reclaim power and to assert power. And so for me, during some of the darkest moments in my life, but then also in responding to horrific things that have happened in our nation's history, writing is an outlet. When I think about writing for social impact, to me, the goal of social impact writing should be to create narratives and stories that humanize people of color and marginalized communities, narratives that challenge the status quo, and also narratives that present an alternative way of viewing the world. For me, social impact writing is about moving people to action. If someone reads something that you've written and they are compelled to take action, I feel like you have done your job. And when I talk about challenging the status quo, a lot of times the articles that we read and the media that we consume, the media has already made a judgment about who is deserving of sympathy and who is not deserving of sympathy. And as a person of faith, those narratives don't always line up with what my faith teaches me about loving everyone and treating everyone with compassion. And an example that comes to mind is earlier this year, March 31st, I believe, 3 young girls from Pinellas County, they were in a car that was reported stolen. I don't know if it was actually stolen. And they were being pursued by the police. These girls were, 2 of them were 15 and 1 was 16, Lanaya, Ashanti, and Dominique. And they were being pursued by police. Their car went into a retention pond, and these girls drowned and they died. And the coverage following their horrific death, it was atrocious. One, they were called, they were accused of taking part in Grand Theft Auto. And if you know anything about the phrase Grand Theft Auto, it applies to a very violent video game. And so when you hear that term, that automatically brings certain images, and what it does over time is it lessens the sympathy that you would have for victims. The other thing about the coverage of these girls is that when the sheriff's office did a press conference talking about what happened, they posted pictures of the girls' mugshots. No pictures of the girls with their families, no pictures of the girls in school. They posted pictures of the mugshots. And so, you know, when we're watching that and consuming that media, there's a value statement made about the lives of those girls. And the story is much more complicated than that, but writing for social impact is challenging that narrative. The other interesting thing about that case is the girls were referred to as women. And, you know, at 15 years old, you are far from being a woman. You know, I remember when I was 22 and I still felt like I had a ways to go. But the fact that they were considered women really struck me. And I wondered if white girls their age had been in a similar situation, how would they be described? So that's what I mean about challenging the narratives that we receive through the media. Lucy, can you go on to the next slide? So, so the language that we use is really important. I also think that a lot of times we label people based on their condition or based on a prior mistake. And so what I mean by their condition or a prior mistake is we've all heard the words felon, ex-convict, convict. Those words create an other, and they basically send the message that those people are different. And if you are trying to create a whole society or a beloved society, we have to be careful how we other people in our writing. I think another way that we can write for social impact is to think critically about the news that we consume. I was reading an article earlier this year about a woman who was missing. Initially, it was reported that she was missing. And then shortly after that, it was revealed that she had allegedly stolen $10,000 from her employer. And the sheriff on the television, the way that he was talking about the woman, I knew the woman was white. And basically what he did was he was appealing to her to turn herself in, that everyone makes mistakes, and that if she came back, they could find a solution to the problem. And I thought, you know, the same level of humanity that she deserves, but you don't always see that with the media. And so part of what writing for social impact is thinking critically about how different communities are portrayed and being intentional that we are not also adopting that language and how we talk about people who are different from us. I spoke of this earlier, but words and phrase that other or that contribute to othering. So, I mean, a lot of times, if you look at how young people of color are portrayed in the media, young people of color are typically portrayed in a binary as either a victim of crime or a perpetrator of crime. And that kind of creates an other. If you think about the word thug and when thug is used, thug is almost always used to describe someone who is a person of color and African American. And that image, just when you hear the word thug or when you read it, you automatically think violent, dangerous, you might even think subhuman. And so you are not going to take certain steps to protect that person, and you basically have an image of who that person is. Another way that another thing that stands in the way of writing for social impact is adopting the criminal justice playbook for language. And so the criminal code has a set of words and phrases that they use, and we have to be careful not to use those words and phrases either. And that ties back into what I was saying about felon or ex-convict. I mean, that's what the criminal justice system uses. That is not the language that we should use if we are working on social justice. A couple other things is, I think we miss the mark when we don't put a picture on pain, or when we don't appropriately describe who's at risk. And so when we talk about immigrants, studies show that even if, America is a nation made up of immigrants. However, the longer you've been in this country and the longer your family has been in this country, your connection and your ability to relate to immigrants is diminished just because it's not recent history. So when we use terms like immigrant without putting a face on who is the immigrant, it's the mother that's separated from her kids. It's the father who will never see his siblings again. It's the child whose parents were deported and that child has been left to fend for themselves. Without putting a picture on the pain or really breaking down what these words mean, then it's hard to build sympathy for our causes. And it's the same way with union workers. If you think about who belongs to a union and just how people feel about unions, America is in a very different place today than what it was in 1935, when more people belonged to unions. And so to say union worker, that doesn't really resonate. But if you talk about a home health care worker or a nursing home worker or a teacher, I mean, that's a way to really describe who it is you're talking about, and then to build sympathy. So all of what I'm saying, contributes to being intentional about using words and phrases that don't vilify people who look different from us, and that also allow people in the stories that we tell to really have their full humanity. And part of the way that we do that is by linking people back in the context of family. Lucy, can you go to the next slide? So writing for social impact, it really requires carefully selecting your words. And a lot of us, we're not sure, if we're not a part of a certain community, we may not know how certain words and phrases impact that community. For instance, I've been guilty of saying, turn a deaf ear, turn a blind eye. But I am someone who I'm able-bodied, I can see and I can hear. And so that is really offensive. It can be really offensive to people who've lost their eyesight or who have never been able to hear. And so, really being careful about how we select our words. I also think that writing for social impact requires tapping into values-based messaging. If you're leading a campaign on the importance of restoring voting rights for people with prior felony convictions, you really want to tap into the value that everyone deserves a second chance. And I think that is a value that is based on faith traditions, but it's also a value that most people across America subscribe to. And so by selecting your words and your writing based on values, you really do yourself a favor and push the ball forward. I also think that understanding your frame as well as your opponent's frame is good. And what I mean by that is there's a tool in the communications toolkit, and it's a message box. And you talk about how you see yourself, how you see the person who maybe disagrees with you, how they see you, and how they see themselves. And understanding where you fall really helps you to create a message that speaks to your audience while also addressing some of the concerns that perhaps people who think differently than you have raised. And finally, I'll say that the other thing that's important for writing for social impact is thinking strategically about the problem, the solution, and why what you're offering makes sense. And so by doing these things, you're able to better articulate the action that you want people to take, and then to clearly articulate what that is, what the next step is, so that in anything that you write, you are making an ask or you are making reference to a solution. And so I'll stop there and turn it over to Catherine, who can provide some more concrete information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that step-by-step guide of what it takes to write prophetically, with truth, with power, but one that also recognizes the full humanity of those that we write about, because these are not just about issues, these are real lives, real people.
That's
So
right.
thank you for taking great care to do that. And yes, we will now turn to Catherine, who will elaborate more on some case studies of what it all means. What does it look like to write for social justice or for social impact? But first, I'd love to introduce Catherine. She is my great sister here at Sojourners in the fight for putting faith in action for social justice, where we focus on media messaging and advocacy. And I know no one better to do that and serve with than Catherine Woodiwiss. She serves here as our Senior Associate Web Editor for our online publication. She's been published in a variety of mediums and has spoken on a variety of panels. Just a real talented writer and just great person all around. And so please engage with her through Twitter at CH Woodiwiss and also at Sojourners. And folks, keep those questions coming in at Sojo Women. Continue to delve into writing for social justice. So Catherine, please tell us.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Elena. One phrase that Jennifer, you used just now was carefully selected words when talking about language. And I think that is so important. In our work at Sojourners, we are constantly trying to learn and improve our own language, our language use, and who is being encompassed or accidentally excluded by the words that we use. So I thought as an instructive follow-up for what Jennifer just presented here may be helpful is a case study of how media coverage treated an example of pretty egregious injustice in recent times. The case study here is Brock Turner, which is a name I'm sure all of you listening in are familiar with. What I wanted to start with is showing some examples of reputable, well-respected outlets, the language that they initially used around this case. And in fact, in many cases used throughout the whole time his name was in headline news. So what you'll see on this slide on the left is a tweet from USA Today saying Martha Stewart served more jail time than former Stanford swimmer Brock Turner. On the right is a tweet from Time saying Stanford swimmer Brock Turner to be released from jail Friday. And if you look closely, the tagline says he was released 3 months early for good behavior. And the poll image on this tweet is a little goofy. You can only see the top of his head, but it's a picture of him looking, you know, he's very like wide-eyed, innocent, looks young, looks just the, you know, innocent, right? That the connotation there is he couldn't possibly be capable of wrongdoing. So if you look at some of the subtle language and image uses here, both tweets refer to Stanford, which signifies accomplishment, achievement, privilege. Stanford is very hard to get into. It's a signifier of success and up and coming, an ambitious, you know, future leader, possibly. Both refer to his athletic prowess by calling him a swimmer. And both images, and this is more clear on the left tweet, show he's in a suit. He looks, you know, what we associate as professional, put together, successful. USA Today also included a really interesting comparison with Martha Stewart. And this tweet could be interpreted in any number of ways, but I found it really interesting that the comparison they link Brock Turner with is Martha Stewart, who is a very famous, very influential, very successful white woman. And comparing the jail time there implicitly tags him to someone that white audiences know, may respect, in any case know as a highly successful celebrity almost. So these tweets and others like them caused a lot of pushback, especially online, and I think rightly so. This is for someone who was accused of raping a young woman and faced very little jail time. These are very positive and optimistic presentation of the situation at hand. If you want to go to the next slide, Lucy, this was followed up by a lot of the long-form coverage on Brock Turner. This is from the Washington Post, the headline, "All-American Swimmer Found Guilty of Sexually Assaulting Unconscious Woman on Stanford Campus." Again, some of these words could be interpreted in a variety of ways, but All-American Swimmer, that was a designation based on his swimming achievements, but simply calling him All-American normalizes him into what we consider the all-American narrative. He's a healthy, strong, young male, all-American male, which is obviously problematic in any number of ways. There's also the inclusion of an unconscious woman, which again could be interpreted in the correctly horrific scale, or the horrific detail of this case. But it could also be implicitly implying that, there was a lot of discussion around her, whether she was intoxicated, whether she was more drunk than he was. And we're all very familiar with the narrative of the woman who is either too, quote unquote, sexually liberated or is drunk and is somehow, quote unquote, asking for it. So this is also a really unhelpful, I would say, headline, and describing a really tragic violation of a young woman's life and well-being. If you go to the next slide, I've included some screenshots of this article from the Washington Post. The text is small, so you may have to lean into the screen a bit to read. But if we just take a minute or two, I'll let you all skim through this. And Elena, I'm not sure, can people respond on the webcast as is, or I should just keep narrating through?
Narrate on, and they can respond via Twitter.
Oh, great. Okay, great. So take the next few seconds and just skim through these paragraphs. They're intentionally overlapped a bit, but getting every word is not important in this case. What you'll notice as you read through, this is the first paragraph on the top left. The victim was so intoxicated at the time of the incident, she didn't wake up for 3 hours afterward. They described the alleged culprit as a baby-faced Stanford freshman. He was on a varsity swim team, one of the best in the country. And then the next paragraph down, suddenly he was accused of rape. And so just those two paragraphs are framing him as a young achiever who suddenly had a terrible accusation levied at him. The top on the right says, it was a stunning fall from grace for Turner. Once a record-setting swimming prodigy, he is now a convicted sex offender at age 20. If you go to the next slide, Lucy. This narrative continued throughout this entire piece, and this was a long-form Washington Post report. The reporting was solid. They didn't get facts wrong, but all of the language they're using, notice they're choosing to focus on Turner's story. They're trying to find out what could possibly have gone wrong in this young man's life to commit such a heinous act. Throughout this piece, there are suggestions that maybe some people are characterizing him poorly, that any number of things could have happened. We don't really know the details. The woman herself may have played a role in what ended up happening to her. And all of this is really irresponsible, as Jennifer was talking about, language that harms rather than heals. There is in the work of justice, it is our duty and our mission to believe and recognize the image of God. I use the image of God speaking from a faith-based publication, but the image of dignity and humanity in each of us. And so it's hard to see a case like this where Brock Turner is a human and deserves dignity and respect, but also this was a gross violation of a young woman's agency, of her body, of her dignity, of her humanity, and how to write in a way that treats that harm and protects the one who has been violated first and foremost, is more of our mission as people who write for justice. And so to see this coverage, this was a standout case from the last year of a young man who is white, who is academically privileged, who is economically privileged, who is gender and sexuality privileged, getting the benefit of the doubt, getting the benefit of affirmation, normalization, acceptance from the media repeatedly, while there was very little to no major effort to push back on the actions he did as a terrible crime and speak up more on behalf of the woman. So this was problematic coverage. Sojourners took a bit of a different response when he was released from jail. If you go to the next slide, this was the meme image that we used. And the title of this slide says "Correcting for Harm." Sometimes in the work of justice, especially as storytellers, I think there is a burden to continue reporting the facts as is, of course, but also through that, correct against narratives that are harmful or taking on a really oppressive and just disrespectful framing. So we saw all of this language coming out and just thought there is a lot more going on here. There's a lot of context that's being missed. There's a lot of gravity to this situation that it just requires more context, and there is harm happening that needs to be corrected for. So we took a little more of a context justice approach. You'll notice we chose to use his mugshot in this meme, and we did that as a pushback against all of the pictures of him in a suit and tie. We also used the numbers of what his crime could have been, what was requested, what was sentenced, and when he was released. And we did that to show the legal gravity of what he had committed versus the privilege that he carried by walking out so early. This is an interesting intersection of gender justice and racial justice at the same time. We are, sexual violence, sexual assault is a really awful reality, and it's an abuse of gender privilege. What's also at work here is a privilege for white Americans in our legal system. And both of these were at play. And we actually had conversations in the office about how do we talk about this being both without minimizing either one of the dynamics that's going on here. So this is what we came up with. I'm not sure that it's perfect, but we were going for fully recognizing both the gender and racial imbalances that were happening. If you go to the next slide. So here was our write-up on it. We just used the same headline as was in our little image meme here. And if you take a moment to read through, again, the text is a little small, so sorry to make you all squint. Towards the end of the left, the screenshot on the left, we wrote, his case has been a stunning, if not unusual, example of white male privilege. Here intentionally tagging both racial and gender elements at play. Rape is incredibly hard to prosecute, and there's great social pressure that shames or silences rape victims. But then we went on to say, this is also how it stands out as white privilege. And we brought up several other men that were charged with very similar crimes, and were all men of color and all faced much stronger sentences, to put his sentence in a little more of the larger racial cultural context as well. So this was our response, and I think when we think about writing justice stories, Jennifer laid out some really helpful parameters to think through. One of the most important, I think, is context. Putting a story of harm in its systemic and historical context to say, this is one-off a problem, but this is a pattern of problematic behavior in our legal system, in our culture, in our news outlets and media and storytelling, the way we talk about these issues, that is adding up to a much greater, more systemic problem. So that's the approach we took here. There have been any number of stories throughout the year that require similar pushback, but this is one example of an attempt to correct for harm, and I'll be eager to hear from those of you who have worked in similar kind of flashpoint moments in justice stories throughout the year. I'd love to hear how you've approached correcting for harm in your own narratives, and what has worked or not. But that's one example of how to spot it, and also one way that we have tried to correct it. So.
Thank you, Catherine. That was absolutely instructive, and just again reminds us the power of language and how the words that we use can either be life-giving or continue to cause harm. And so it's great to think that deeply about what we're writing, how we're writing, who's telling the story, and the nuances that are being brought out. The good work that you're leading at Sojourners to make sure that we are telling the full story and really recognizing the dignity, humanity of those whom we write about. Jennifer, do you want to add anything? We turn into turn to our question audience.
Yeah, I do. So Catherine's case study was really interesting from a lot of different perspectives. But one thing that mainstream media outlets did in the Brock Turner case is they humanized him. And how did they humanize him? They talked about the fact that he was from Stanford. They gave him the opportunity to explain what he wanted to do. And the victim, they shamed the victim by the words they used, by saying that she was unconscious and it took her this long to wake up. That is shaming. And sexual assault, I mean, it can really derail the trajectory of someone's life. So for me, it was really discouraging to watch and to read media reports of this case, and just how little attention was given to the harm that he caused on this young woman's life.
Yes. So sometimes a lone voice to tell a different narrative and to correct for the harms they're being told. But I appreciate writers like Jennifer and Catherine who tell those untold stories and lift up, voices from the margins, but also just, the women and the people of color who just don't get a fair, unbiased hearing or message that's being told about them. And so it's incumbent upon us to have who can really think about context and nuance, and as you say, to challenge the status quo. The great responsibility for us as writers and as journalists. And so we have some great questions from our audience, people who really want to know a bit more about, how do we do this and do it well? Justice. So I appreciate this question that's coming in at Sojo Women from Avis de Davis, in which he writes, how can white men best tell stories about women and people of color without perpetuating power and patriarchy or being patronizing? Either of you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think that that sometimes it is helpful for white men to use the privilege that they have to point out inconsistencies and to point out when someone is getting a pass. So in the Brock Turner case, contributing content around that, calling out the hypocrisy in the sentence and also the treatment that he was given, from the photos to him having an opportunity to explain, as a white man, pointing that out and raising your voice in critique of that kind of treatment. And then I also think that there are times that that white men need to take their cue from impacted people. And so from women and people of color, and being in community with these groups and asking, okay, is this a moment where I sit back and collect information, or is this a moment where I weigh in?
Absolutely. I was going to say, listen, listen. I think there's, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd be surprised what that'll do. We listen deeply to each other's stories and experiences. Again, just to note, the industries of mainstream media are comprised primarily of white journalists. And so I love the advice that you both give to make sure that, writers are being aware of their own privilege, and then also using that privilege to make sure that they are using the platforms and the voices that they have access to make sure that other stories are lifted up with fairness and equality. Let's continue pressing on and hoping that our fellow journalists will maintain that responsibility, especially if they are white. All right, we have another question.
Can I add one more thing? Can I add one more thing to the first question? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times we overlook our sphere of influence. And so to the person who just asked the question, even if you are not creating content, you should be organizing the men in your life, the men and boys in your life, and talking to them about systems of oppression and in ways that you can resist those systems. And so sometimes, the action that we need to take is right in our own communities, right in our own families and our friends. And so organizing where you are and within your own sphere of influence is a great place to start as well.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. All right, we have a question from Hannah Critch, and she writes, how do you approach asking others to share their stories, especially when it involves retelling about personal oppression or marginalization? How do you balance that?
I can answer that one. I have learned to, begin by asking permission, but also by being very clear about who you are and what you're hoping for. So if we take this, you're doing an interview in service of a story, explaining what your aim is with a story, acknowledging that it may be hard for them to share their own story, that you're here to listen to it, and that you are willing to work with whatever they're comfortable giving. That's been my approach. And it's hard because sharing stories about personal pain and trauma requires a lot of trust. And so I've found that the more that you can communicate a very genuine intent to take them seriously, take their story seriously, and listen to what they're giving you, the more trust that builds with the people you're engaging with.
I don't have anything else to add.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. One who likes to tell stories, but also have been the subject of some really hard stories to tell. And you're right, it does take a lot of trust and for someone, being that kind of voice and power for someone to take it seriously. And so I appreciate when writers can do that and do it well.
And I think it's also good.
All right, we have.
Oh, Elena, can I add one thing?
Yes.
I think it's also good to acknowledge that there is sharing a painful story is risky. And I've done that before where I've said, I take this subject seriously. I want to hear what you're saying and represent it faithfully. But as, I'm an individual writer, there may be things I get wrong or I represent incorrectly. And I just know that that's a risk, and that's, I'm not aiming for harm in any way, but it may happen. And, please speak up if it is, and we'll work with it. But I think an acknowledgement that you understand that this is a risk that they're taking also is really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, so we have some other questions here. One from David Beltran, who asks, from your experience, Catherine, Jennifer, how do we best engage in dialogue with those we fundamentally disagree with through our writing? And so, yeah, I'm personally curious about that, because knowing that, you want to be objective journalists, but how do you engage on topics that you may personally fundamentally disagree with? And again, in light of the context that we're in with a lot of fake news, anti-PC culture circulating, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I can start. I think that that we have to get better at engaging people who think fundamentally different than we do. And earlier in my presentation, I talked about the message box. Understanding what you say about you, what people who think differently say about you, what you say about them, and then what they say about themselves. And unless we are engaging people who think differently than we do, then it is hard to message around that difference. I think that the reason that the most recent election may have taken a lot of people by surprise is because we are so used to and comfortable talking to people who think the way that we think. And it's hard to move people. There's some people, like if you think about the organizing model, there are some people who you are never going to move. But then there are other people who possibly, with work, you could move them. And so I think that it's difficult when someone, when their worldview, which is informed by their own experiences, is diametrically opposed to your worldview. And sometimes, we write things or we share things and then we get a reaction, and it's easy to discount people who think differently. But I think we have to challenge ourselves to at least be willing to hear. And to hear is not necessarily to be tolerant of intolerance, because we don't want to get there. But I think that we could all stand to push ourselves a little bit more to engage people who are not coming to the table, with the same perspective, so to speak.
To add just a bit to that, being an editor for a faith-based publication is a little tricky, because even just within the religion of Christianity, understandings of theology and how that intersects with politics is so heightened and sometimes so volatile that it can be very challenging to know, how do we engage thoughtfully on flashpoint questions, like the question of abortion is still a very hot topic for a lot of faith communities. How do we talk about that in a responsible and wise and compassionate way? And I think in my role as editor, that allows, as a publication broadly, that allows us a little bit of flexibility to host a variety of voices, some of whom I may not personally agree with. In fact, many of whom historically I've not necessarily personally agreed with. But what I'm looking for there is what you're saying is it rooted in love? Is it rooted in thoughtfulness? Is it factually correct? Is it, you know, are there, you can toss out things that are just sort of just, you know, the worst of the differing opinions, but looking for people who are, it's very clear, are very honestly, thoughtfully, lovingly trying to engage with a question, versus those who just have a very closed opinion on something. And that's been, the position of editor for me has been a really good challenge for me personally in how to discern between different viewpoints that are harmful to individuals or large communities of people, and different viewpoints that are important and serious and cause division, but are being very thoughtfully and earnestly engaged on. I'm not sure if that made sense, but it's the role of editor for me has been a chance to exercise practicing how we engage and what constitutes being worth engaging on. So.
Yes. Ooh, and isn't that a challenge? My goodness. To champion good storytelling, truth telling, but also one that really does tell the whole story. And so I have a question for each of you. Now that you've given us an inside look into your craft and how you do it and why you do it. If you could tell me what stories in the media this year, I'm curious, have impacted you the most, either positively or negatively. I'd love to hear, you know, what are those sources for great writing or perhaps not so great?
So for me, what I was sharing with you all a little bit earlier about the 3 young girls who died when their car went into a retention pond, that story was, it touched me on a lot of different levels. One, because I have a teenage son and I, you know, think about, okay, if something happened to him, how would the world perceive him? What narratives would be constructed to justify a decrease in sympathy? So that impacted me quite a bit. The level of toxicity and hatred on the presidential campaign trail also had an impact on me, primarily because I felt early on in the political process that whoever won, there had already been so much damage done that we would be undoing the damage of this election cycle for years to come. So the fear-mongering, the racist rhetoric, the fact that that was brought into the mainstream. And then, you know, the media. I mean, the media seems to, I don't want to be too harsh. I mean, what comes to mind is to be a lapdog for injustice. And certainly that is probably based on how different reporters see themselves and their role in the world. But just looking at how the media pacifies certain actions and individuals has been, you know, pretty challenging, and then create space for people to explain themselves, some people and not others. So those are some of the things, you know, there's obviously been a lot of coverage about police brutality and downright violence, and that is difficult to watch over and over again. You know, for me, I am not a journalist. I'm a PR professional who's an advocate. And so I write as a way to elevate stories. And a lot of times when I write, it's in response to something that I've seen. So I'll stop there.
The big obvious one that's impacted me is just the entire story of Trump this whole year. There was, just every day, the stories of very frightening human rights violations by people who are claiming his name for their actions, all the way up to possible incoming abuses of our legal system and our democratic system as is. It's just, very sobering, and in some ways very frightening, start to finish. And I think that that entire story, and even to be a little meta about it, the story that the media created about the story that is Trump, has been really, it just feels like a bit of heavy winds kind of constantly, trying to get our bearings on what the most important and what the most pressing issues and stories and questions are. One of the data points in there for me that was personally very convicting was the number of white women, and in particular white evangelical Christian women, who voted for Trump. That's been something that has been not altogether surprising for the just in terms of election numbers, but has been challenging to me, as to get back to the previous question, reaching across the aisle on people that disagree with you. I think I am simultaneously very aware of my identity as a woman as regards to patriarchy and kind of the male dominance of power, especially, I mean, in the media, but in all sectors. And I also simultaneously am aware that I am not fully aware of my privilege as a white straight person. And so holding both of those realities in tension post the election in particular has been really challenging, to acknowledge that straight white women, my demographic, have voted for someone that I think is going to be the indirect or direct cause for a lot of justice abuses in the future, and how to own that about my own identity, but also speak with those who share my identity to help change things. That's been my own personal kind of the story that impacted me. But just one little note too about a good story in the news. I think we're looking at so many stories that are negative or fear-inducing or just really sobering ahead. And in that, I think it's also important to be shining lights on the stories of justice that are continuing. And so our lead online editor, Sandy Villarreal, this week has been doing work highlighting the sanctuary movement for churches, and now campuses are attempting to get in on this, and whole cities that are offering protection to immigrants and saying they will not comply with immigration enforcement officials who try to accelerate deportations. She's done a lot of reporting work on communities. San Antonio, for example, just had a large release of women and children migrants, and she reported on the efforts of the city to step up and shelter those people. And that's a beautiful story of justice that's happening in the context of this bigger, much more troubling thing. So even while we stay vigilant and stay on top of all of the troubling things that are going on, I am also looking for and really grateful to be working alongside those who are looking for stories of where humans are getting it right and trying to continue to highlight that as well. So
I think that's really important, is that we are creating the stories that we want to see, not just in media, but also using our own power and our own institutions. So Sojourners has been a wonderful resource for putting these stories out. But I think that's a great point, that we should be creating and telling the stories that we want to see.
Amen. Goodness. And with that note, I think we'll have to sadly wrap up our time together, but I have been to sit at the feet of Catherine and Jennifer here, just to glean your wisdom. No, I mean it. It's real, and it is true that that we have the power to create and do good things, and to tell stories that are contributing to the common good and to human flourishing. And so I thank you both for doing that in all your spheres of influences, in your communities, in your families. And it is not one that we see often enough. And so I thank you for helping us today to bring this training and giving us some of the tools and concepts and ways that we can be thinking about the messages that we're hearing, we're consuming, but also ones in which that we distribute and hold up. And so I really want to encourage everyone who's tuned in today and those who'll be watching later to continue to check out the good work of Catherine Woodiwiss. You can find her at Sojourners and at CH Woodiwiss on Twitter. And of course, to our dear friend Jennifer Farmer, who serves at PICO as the Managing Director for Communications. And absolutely, I will be picking up her book in June 2017.
Thank you.
Extraordinary PR, yep, or Ordinary Budgets. That, you know, even if we are not content creators, all of us can do something through organizing, through social media. And so I think I'm really looking forward to your book, Jennifer, because it sounds like a really good step-by-step guide on how to engage in the public sphere. And so it's incredible to be among these women throughout the series, but also with both of you as women of faith and as leaders, and just telling some really powerful stories that need to be heard. So bless you both in that good work as you continue forward. And thank you again for all that you do and who you are and what you bring to not just the wider movement, but for justice. So thanks again, and we'll be in touch. All right. Thanks, friends. Everyone tuned in. Bye now.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.